So some of you survived the message. I'm happy to say I see some bodies in front of me that actually didn't get killed by history. See, here's the problem, is that's where I can spend a lot of my time. And the more you probe, the more you find out how little you know, which is the delight, because that keeps your feet on the ground and you never get to be so conceited as to say that you know everything. Having said that, I opened up just a few different subjects and left them dangling. Some of them that I want to just give you an idea of what we've yet to cover. I was talking to you about the Latin translations, and specifically the Vulgate. And apparently it's already been accomplished. I already have a fine example of the 7th, 8th century manuscript that I showed you in the service. They can just flash that up real quick of what I shared with you. But this is a whole subject worthy of covering on its own. See, when you don't do too much in-depth, you hear a few tidbits and it maybe is sufficient, and I know where now a little knowledge becomes dangerous. To pinpoint the origin of the Latin translations becomes extremely difficult, but it seems as though we see things backwards. It's clear enough to me that the oldest examples that we have of the Greek and perhaps the Coptic manuscripts, which I've shown you, have we'll call them, it's a swing somewhere in the definitely 3rd century, we'll even call it slightly earlier. But the Latin manuscripts, there's a mystery shrouded behind the history and origin of it, because interestingly enough, it's Tertullian in North Africa who will be technically, no one wants to admit it, but technically chronicled as the first theological writer or treatise presenter of the New Testament world in that language, in that realm. But depending on whose history you read, you may not get that because of Tertullian's association with a sect in the last part of his life, which the Catholic Church wanted to make sure when it prepared its history, it kind of stayed away from hands off, don't touch that. So some of the history will begin with Cyprian. And Cyprian is in the 250s. I think he was martyred in 257 or something, in Carthage. And why this becomes important is because he is not the first Latin writer or chronicler. And in fact, we know about Cyprian, he used a manuscript which we know definitively that he used, called the Codex Bobensius, or it's a close pronunciation. We know definitively he used that manuscript, which pushes the dating back to the Latin manuscripts much earlier than we previously would have assumed, although we don't have earlier evidence. But the big question is, why North Africa? Why not Rome? Why not Asia Minor? Why North Africa for Latin? And the question gets deeper and deeper as you move forward in the history of the Latin translations. By the time that Jerome is commissioned in 383 by Pope Damasus to produce a standardized translation, becoming Jerome's Latin Vulgate, there had to have already been in circulation thousands, probably in the order of at least 10,000, not complete, but circulating manuscripts. And Jerome's response to Damasus is, well, there's so many manuscripts, and whatever I do, I'll be accused of. And then later Augustine says, on the same order, Anyone who has a little bit of linguistic knowledge immediately undertakes a translation, and there are so many abound. Who's to say which one is correct? So it's almost a black hole to walk into, and it's equally as fascinating to see the progression of the Eastern and Western churches, their manuscript, the perpetuity and the care. It's then no small miracle that a Latin translation at this late age, this 7th century we just put on the screen for you, would survive and even have the same bearings as the Greek text that we looked at, as I've referred to as P72, let alone other evidences, like I referenced manuscript, last festival manuscript called MS 193, no relation, of course. So these are the things that I really think are fascinating. They open up to explore ideas, and certainly to see what happens as we get down the road where theological minds are now being able to print, because with the advent of the printing press, now every single person who has theological opinions is now able to produce in volumes and mass distribute. So we enter into that age kind of looking backwards and thinking how God preserved His Word, even with all of these different apparatus and papyri and manuscripts, is remarkable, considering the corruption that kept trying to creep back into the church throughout history. One of those debates I referred to in the message, we're going to see as we study the Latin translation of the word foreknowledge. And that's why I had to show you what happened with election and who moved the elect. But a strange thing happens, and I'll just show it to you quickly. This is another one of my techniques on how to get you to watch Festival tomorrow night. I collect, and I have a very large library of study tools, and this is just the greatest thing that I could possibly have in my library. It's Erasmus's annotations on the New Testament from Galatians to the Apocalypse, facsimile of the final Latin text with all earlier variants. Editor is E.J. Brill. Brilliant presentation, and brilliant because I'll show you what that looks like. If you can take a picture of this page. I can't tell if I'm focused or not. So can you see that, folks? Okay. I think I need to put my glasses on. But I did, this is all in Latin, by the way, and it's the annotations of Erasmus from Galatians to Apocalypse, containing 1 Peter as well. And it was a little bit disturbing because as I read through it, there are certain things that dawned on me that had I not opened this volume up, I would not have seen something that is so staggering. Unfortunately, somewhere in my volume of copious notes, I did a whole translation of that page, unfortunately, because Latin is such a beast that you can read it and we can limp through it together, but if I can't find the translation for you, you can see what I do in my spare time is I like to draw on, so it looks like that. All right. And the apparatus which this gives is such a great tool, and I'm so blessed that I have access to these tools. And you, in turn, become beneficiary because I share them with you. So this particular example of what I've just showed you of the annotations, the text being used here is the text from 1535. It's a 1535 Latin text. And what is remarkable, if you'll see, can you see these numbers in the margin, 19 and 27 and an asterisk and 22? See those? All right. Those represent additions to the work in the years that they were added. So as the text was revised and modified, each number, let me show that to you again now, down this right here, shows you the years in which the modification, addition, try and show this right here. So we're looking at all these numbers. Shows it, so in other words, 1522, 1519, and so forth. And then there are markings that indicate, so you can see how much adjusting was done to the text. Now, again, this is only, I'm only talking to those people who really want to know, because some people will say, listen, just give me the facts and don't bore me, And if that's your attitude, I don't even know why you're alive. But, sorry. But part of learning about these different tools and apparatus is learning that there are so many things our eyes don't get to see, particularly this commentary, which some part of it appears on the back in front of these pages, is translated. And the annotations flag something. I won't bore you with all the translation that I did, because I had to translate the whole thing. But later down, after he talks about who perhaps Peter was writing to in his commentary, and then he goes on to say things like, you can understand, those of you who speak Espanol, you'll understand. It says, no es greke, the word. Then they made a mistake. They made a typo here, and they flipped the words. So it's not Greek, and they're writing the word that is a correction, which is I can't even read it, so small. Plutos for pari epidemos, and they flipped the words and made a mistake. So whoever was the editor, shame on you. But I think it was Erasmus that did it. Oops. All right, blame the dead guy. So, but he goes on to explain some very interesting things. For example, why he believes that Peter, to which group that he's writing, and he makes some very interesting annotations. But here's what flagged my attention. He says, secundum presentiam, following or after prescience, pre-knowledge. Iuxta, next, preordination, next, predestination or preordination, or prefinitionem, predetermined purpose. And that's how I've translated it for the ease of separating the words. It dawned on me that as we get into the text, you're going to see some of the Latin translations are going to use praesentium, the correct word, sent, where you get science in the English, which would be our word for to know, going not gnosis, but from the Latin streams. So to know, versus the translations that will include preordained, that is predetermined by God, versus predetermined purpose. And it's very, you may say you're engaging in semantics, but it's completely not semantics to define. Knowing something is not the same as knowing something and telling you, if I'm God, I'm not, but I'm speaking as though if I was pertaining to have the foreknowledge, foreknowing is not the same as proclaiming and telling you, and foreknowledge is not the same as predetermining the outcome, which these words will undoubtedly forge a theological nightmare. And now I'm starting to read commentaries and think, oh, you poor fools that spent all your time talking about this particular episode of something that really doesn't even exist. Sorry, I mean, I don't want to insult. There are topics and theological issues to debate, but don't debate it where there's no debate. Now, that's just food for thought. We'll get to that problem when we get there. We will get there. But I have something interesting that I wanted to read to you, share with you. And that is on this very subject between Erasmus and Luther. And it is absolutely mind-boggling to me that while everybody, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, will have an opinion regarding Erasmus, if you really read his history, and I believe this, there are historians that will slight to their bias, but I believe in a reading, a correct reading of Erasmus's history, we will find that prior to him publicly taking on Luther, and he did that under the pressure of the clergy around him that were egging him. The king, the emperor, and the clergy said, attack Luther, attack him, stop him. Behind closed doors, prior to that, if you read the history right, and you read pretty middle-of-the-road history on Erasmus, you'll find Erasmus was actually trying to protect Luther. And it wasn't until he came under the pressure of the people around him that he wrote and attacked this principal issue of the free will. He had to find what he deemed to be the weakest portion for him to make his strongest argument. And it's only within reading that you really begin to see how some of the arguments are extremely brilliant, and some of Erasmus's arguments are very cloaked. And you've got to read it right. I'm not telling you that I'm completely Luther on this side of the fence. The only thing I'm completely Luther is it's by faith alone, sola fide. You got me there. That's where I cast my lot. But Erasmus tended to use words like grace and faith, but he used it in a hybrid sense. And he still had a bent towards going back to the law. And I'm going to give you some scriptures that he used to make his doctrine. And you're going to say, that's what you used to make doctrine out of? I mean, that's that? Rather than some other pretty core pieces of evidence if we were going to start taking position. But I want to read, there's a story in a copy, and it is a copy out of somebody else's work, which is actually out of a general work, so I'm not infringing on anybody's copyright to do this. It's a public work, now common or whatever you want to call it. Erasmus will define his theology like this, and it's defined as the apple story, as I have coined it. Defined in the relationship between a father and his injured son to see the point he is making and to see the error of his idea. Now, this is the copyist's personal opinion and not necessarily mine. In the illustration, he speaks concerning a son who has fallen and has been injured by the fall and is offered an apple by the father. He states that the child, whose legs have been weakened by the fall, could not reach out to take hold of the apple. But the father, wanting to motivate the child to recover, desires the child to make the necessary movements towards the fruit and have it as a reward for his works. Since the child, while desiring it, could not make the movement, and I'm sure he was talking about the apple, the father leads him to it by his hands and thus helps him to obtain the object. The child could not have stood up if the father had not helped him to his feet. He could not have grasped the apple if the father had not assisted his feeble legs. Erasmus even adds that there would have been no apple for the child if the father had not shown him one. This might sound as if Erasmus is ascribing all glory to God alone. In fact, at the end of the analogy, he writes, "What then can the infant claim for itself?" He quickly adds, "And yet the infant does something, but it has nothing to glory in its own powers, for it owes its very self to its father. What then does the child do here? It relies on all of its powers, on the one who lifts it, and accommodates it as best it can, its feeble steps, to him who leads him. No doubt the father could have drawn the child against his will. The child could have resisted by refusing the outstretched apple. The father could have given the apple without the child's having to run to get it, but he preferred to give it in this way, as this was better for the child. I will readily allow that less is due to our industry in following after eternal life than the boy who runs to his father's hand. Now, it's very complex and very mishmash. It's like saying, yes, I am. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Now, it's either all grace or it's not. And if it's not of grace, then it's of works. You can't stand in the middle and say, well, it's kind of this and it's that. Now, I have to conclude one thing. As you get to know why this is controversial, even for a person like me who's not that theologically scored, and I have we don't have some body behind me saying, well, you must stay in this box. I'm reading what Luther says, and I'm thinking to myself, it is by faith and it's grace. And what Erasmus says in some parts makes perfect sense, but he takes the pendulum so far the other way. Now you've got these two forces that are basically pulling, except Erasmus starts off going the other way and then brings it back in the middle and says, no, I'll stay right here. No, I think I'll go over there. And his whole doctrine becomes like that until he finally puts it in writing against Luther. And that could be a whole subject that I could go on and on about. But I want to take you to a few of the texts that, that Erasmus used as the principal basis for his thinking. And I'm just going to read them to you. No, you don't really have to take notes, but Erasmus uses these few things, and it's very disturbing to me because if I was going to make the case on Erasmus's side, I would have used other texts. The texts that he uses are out of 1 Genesis 4, verses 6 and 7, where this is the story of Cain and Abel. And the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, thou shalt not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And so the whole framework is that there is some good that resides in man that makes him able to make the right decision. That gets into that whole decision of how good or how much good must be in a man for a man to make, and I say man generically, not just men as mankind, to make the right decision or to do good. Unfortunately, I wish he would have quoted out of Paul's writing. And he also makes an argument out of Paul's writing and says that Paul, in writing about the clay, does the clay have the power to talk back to the potter, who's quoting Isaiah, is only saying that as a retort to the Jews. Then that completely denies God's sovereignty over mankind as a whole. So you've got to see, it's like a black hole, and once you go in that territory, your brain will spin on all the different obstacles put in the way. Here's Isaiah 1:19 and 20 as a part of the basis for his doctrine. If ye be willing and obedient, ye shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, ye shall be devoured with the sword, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. So if you do good, you'll be saved, and if you don't do good, that sounds like a church I heard about. Here's another one. Isaiah 45 and verse 20. Assemble yourselves and come, draw near together, ye that are escaped of the nations. They have no knowledge that set up the wood of the graven image and pray unto God that cannot save. It's another strange text. I wouldn't use that to make an argument. Out of Ezekiel 18 and verse 31, cast away from you all your transgressions, whereby ye have transgressed. Make you a new heart and a new spirit. You do it. Right? You do it. Because you can do it. But here's the disturbing thing. The crux of his theology is not those verses I just read to you. The basis of the whole foundation, his text for his theology, stems out of what the English translates as the book of Sirach, which is the book of Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus in the Apocryphal. And I'm not saying we know that the Apocryphal books were at one point connected in our Bible, but I'm going to say, as a part of what he selected, this alone on its surface scares me. Ecclesiasticus, which is the book of Sirach, 15, verses 14 through 17. And I'm reading, this is a parallel apocrypha, if such a thing is of interest. Greek, King James, Dewey, Knox, TEV, New Revised, NAB, and NJB. Thank you. He himself made man from the beginning and left him in the hand of his counsel. If thou wilt to keep the commandments and to perform acceptable faithfulness, he hath set fire and water before thee. Stretch forth thy hand unto whether thou wilt. Before man is life and death, and whether him liketh shall be given him. That's the basis for his theology. If you read any evidence in any of the writings, that is the text that he based his doctrine on. Now, this is why Dr. Scott was right. Go back to the sources first. If you're going to stage yourself and put your foot somewhere, place it where Jesus walked. And then in support of that, the Apostle Paul, you can't go wrong. But in every single instance, and I've got a whole bunch of citations of where he gets his doctrines and how his doctrines are. There are texts, he says here, which he insists that it's God's call for us to keep the law, and implies not only the duty to do it, but also the ability to perform it. And he cites Exodus 20. So tell me, what part of Christ's finished work do you not understand if part of your theology is to take people back to Sinai, which is what Paul was speaking against, and Luther was speaking against. So it's quite an interesting hodgepodge of things, but you can understand why Erasmus's translation will be the body of work that influences the bulk of our English Bibles. And that transition will be made perhaps away from the Textus Receptus by the time the NIV is produced, in 1970? There'll be a little bit of a veering because of manuscripts that have been found and new discoveries in 1970 based on the discoveries from 1948 to 1952. But outside of that, the doctrines of the church have already been forged. So that's why it's necessary to go back in, pick apart these verses, find out historically if there was some bias in putting in somebody's 2 cents. In other words, I will get the church world to see my way because my translation will speak of what I believe versus what the writer who was inspired by God intended. That's the mission. So, much more to say, but now I've said much and it's your turn to talk to me. I'd like you to get on the telephone.